This is an RTX 5090 pulled from an HP 45L. Once in a while, I'll run into somebody that tells me or thinks HP's 5090s don't necessarily measure up to your regular 5090s. I've got another 5090. I've got this one, which is the MSI Ventus 3X OC. All right, so before we get started, just to show you what I'm working with here. By the way, I've become quite fond of open benches. They cool better. I don't need as many fans in order to cool better, and they're a lot easier to work with. So just a side note there. But just to show you what I'm working with, this is an extra fan connector that goes to this little doohickey right here. I hope I'm pointing at the right spot because I can't see. This is Thermalright's SSD cooler, and it's got a little tiny fan on it, and that's what that's for. But I've found that I don't really necessarily need it specifically in an open bench. I haven't tested it out in like closed cases and things like that. But that's, again, a tangent, which I have a lot of. Anyways, so the other thing is this is the MSI X870E Carbon Wi-Fi motherboard. I've got 32 gigs of G.Skill DDR5 6000 megatransfers at CL28. The CPU is the 9950X3D, and the CPU cooler is the Thermalright Peerless Assassin, and the SSD is the Crucial T705 Gen 5 SSD. All right, so that's our test rig. And so we're gonna put both these 5090s on. We're gonna test it on some games, do a game average, and maybe one or two other things just to see what it does in other things other than gaming. That was kind of loud. Other things to take a look at is the 5090. You'll be able to see the difference here. The 5090 from the HP OEM, the 45L, it's a little bit longer, as you can see right here, by maybe about an inch or so longer, and it's certainly thicker. If we line these up side by side, you'll see how much taller it sits right there, and maybe we can show the difference on the top camera here. So as you can see, there's a pretty significant difference in size, which means that potentially this cooler might be better than this cooler. It's got a lot more fins on the heatsink and everything. Neither of them have dual BIOS or anything, but I'm not all that worried about that. The other thing of note is the 12 volt 6+2 connector right here is a little bit slanted on the HP Omen. And I think that was by design, possibly to make it easier to remove the connector, maybe. I don't know, but it is, and I'll probably take a picture of this and show it to you guys for a close-up. It does have a slight angle to it. And so those are the main differences. The connectors, the HDMI and the 3 display ports are the same. They're both 3 fan units, as you can see. This one has, the MSI has the 3 fans that are pointed in the same direction, right? Whereas this setup has these 2 fans pointing in the same direction, and then this fan is pointed in the opposing direction, right? So I don't know how much of a difference that makes, but let's put it to the test. Let's run some benchmarks, and I'll be back with the results. First benchmark is Cyberpunk 2077 with Ultra preset, no scaling, no RT, and no frame gen. And as you can see here, we've got a little bit of difference, not a lot of difference in performance as far as frame rates go. And so if you look over here, we've got the GPU stats. This top set right here is for the MSI Ventus 3X SoC, and the bottom stats are for the HP Omen 45L. And then we got a percentage difference. So the delta between the MSI Ventus 3X SoC and the 45L OEM from HP. And so of note here, at 1080p, the average FPS difference is the Omen version of the 5090 beat the MSI Ventus by 1.3% on average FPS at 1080p, and for the 1% lows, it did 0.5% less. So if it's around like 2% or less of difference, that could be just run variance. So just keep that kind of thing in mind moving forward. At 1440p, the HP OEM version did 0.3% better, and at the 1% lows, it did 1.9% worse. And at 4K, it did 1% better, and interestingly enough, it did 2.3% better at the 1% lows at 4K. The most interesting part is the temperatures. So we've got 71.5 C was the top temperature for the GPU for the MSI version, whereas the HP version is at 56.7 C, so running really cool. Same thing with the VRAM, 74 C for the MSI, 60 C for the HP, and fairly close on the power usage at 579.1 watts versus 572.9 watts. So at the end of the day, the main difference, the real difference, is the cooling. Then we got Red Dead Redemption 2, Ultra preset, no scaling, no RT, no frame gen. And as you can see here, again, not a huge difference in the average FPS, but we do have a large difference in the 1% lows. So if you look here, we've got for 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, 0.7%, 0%, and 0.6% difference, where the OEM, the HP OEM, is outperforming the MSI. So again, well within run variance, but the 1% lows are really interesting in that the HP version did much better than the MSI version at 16% increase in 1% lows at 1080p, at 1440p, more than 20% of increased performance, and at 4K, 57.3% of difference. And I did run the Red Dead 2 benchmark a few times. So these are average numbers that I got, which I found pretty interesting. Now, going back to the GPU stats, again, we've got a huge difference in temperatures at 72C versus 55.4C, 78C for the VRAM versus 62C, and relatively close power usage at 554.8 watts versus 542.9 watts. And we did Monster Hunter Wilds with the Ultra preset. You can't turn off anti-aliasing. Well, you can, but then everything gets really blurry. The best setting that I could for native settings would be TAA at 100. I don't know why that F is there. That's just a misprint right there. No RT, no frame gen. And again, on our average FPS, pretty close together at 0%, 0.4%, and 0.7% respectively. But this time, the MSI kind of edged out, for the most part, the HP Omen at the 1% lows. It did 6.2% better than the HP version at 1080p. The HP did do 0.7% better at 1440p, but then again, at 4K, the MSI did 0.7% better. And again, with the GPU stats, we've got huge temperature variance between the MSI and the HP version of the 5090. And so the GPU's top temperature came in at 68.1 C versus 53.4 C. VRAM temperatures came in at 72 C versus 60 C. And again, fairly close power usage, 482.7 watts versus 484.8 watts. Then we did Black Myth Wukong at cinematic preset. Scaling's minimized, no RT, no frame gen. And again, still within run variance on the average FPS and technically on the 1% lows. And so not a huge amount, but overall the HP version of the 5090 is performing better. And again, we've got huge variance in the temperatures where the MSI, the GPU top temperature came in at 65.8 C versus 51.4 C. VRAM came in at 72 C versus 58 C. Little less power on the HP this time by about, like, I'd say about 5% of difference maybe, where we did 465.8 watts on the MSI version versus 443.1 watts. Then I did Marvel Rivals benchmark with the Ultra preset. I couldn't find a way to turn off any anti-aliasing, and probably you don't want to, so that you have a decent quality visuals. So TAA was set at 100, no RT, no frame gen. And again, the HP 5090 did slightly better than the MSI version on average FPS, as you can see. Interesting results on the 1% lows. If we look over here, here's the results for the average FPS as far as the HP doing better. And then at the 1% lows at 1080p, HP did 3.9% better. At 1440p, it did 4% better. But at 4K, it did 5.4% less. So that was interesting. Although, to keep things fair and in context, we're talking a less than 3 FPS of difference on the 4K 1% lows. And then on the GPU temperatures, the MSI top temperature came in at 68.6 C, whereas the HP version came in at 53.7 C. On the top VRAM temperature for the MSI version came in at 74 C versus 60 C for the HP. And fairly close together on the power usage at 505.1 watts versus 491 watts. And I ran 3D Mark Steel Nomad benchmark. Still pretty close together between the two, but the MSI did edge out the HP version at 1080p average FPS, as well as slightly on the 1440p. But the Omen pulls ahead by 2.6% at 4K. And similarly, on the 1% lows, we've got the MSI beating the HP version at 1080p by 1.6%. It did better than the HP version at 1440p 1% lows by 1.8%. But again, the HP pulls ahead a decent amount, almost 4% at 4K on the 1% lows. Continuing the trend, the top GPU temperature for the MSI version came in at 77.6 C versus 58.5 C. The top VRAM temperature came in at 78 C for the MSI, and the HP came in at 62 C. Both fairly close together on power usage at 577.2 watts versus 586 watts. Then I used 3D Mark TimeSpy Extreme, and once again, fairly close together on the average FPS, although the MSI does beat the HP at 1080p by 2.1%. The HP version pulls ahead at 1440p by 1.4% and at 4K by 1.3%. At the 1% lows, fairly tight race between the two, with HP doing slightly better by 0.5% at 1080p, 1% at 1440p, and 0.5% again at 4K. And then again, continuing to be pretty impressive on the temperatures for the HP. The MSI GPU top temperature came in at 77.8 C versus the HP at 58.6 C. Top VRAM temperature for MSI came in at 78 C versus HP at 64 C. And the power usage is pretty close together again. So 581.2 watts versus 579.5 5 watts. And then for rendering, we used Blender version 5.1.0's benchmark. Using the GPU test at samples per minute, we've got pretty tight race between the two on Monster at well over 7,000 samples per minute. The MSI version did 0.3% better on Junk Shop, but essentially the same score between the two. And same thing with Classroom, whereas essentially the same score, with MSI pulling slightly ahead by 0.3% in Classroom. And over here, I put the top GPU temperature at 61.6 C versus 50.3 C. VRAM came in at 70 C versus 58 C. And power draw came in at 427.3 watts versus 416.3 watts. And then just for shits and giggles, I thought I'd do a overall average so that we can see what our real differences are over the course of those 7 benchmarks. So as you can see, MSI version comes in a little bit higher by 0.4 FPS on average versus the HP at 1080p Ultra. 1% lows, 1440p Ultra, 1440p 1% lows, 4K Ultra, and 4K 1% lows. The HP Omen outperforms the MSI. And as you can see, the overall across the board differences, the HP does 0.3% better for average FPS. And then on the 1% lows, the HP Omen version does 2.4% better. Then when we go down here, it says 8 benchmark average temperatures and power. And so as you can see here, the overall average temperatures, we're looking at a delta of more than 20% on both the GPU temperature and the VRAM temperature, while the HP Omen is using less watts. Not a lot less, but 1.3% less. So that was interesting. So the overall takeaway is that the HP Omen, at least out of the box, versus the MSI Ventus 3X out of the box, the HP version actually outperforms the MSI Ventus 3X OC slightly. But more importantly, it does so while pulling less power and staying pretty cool. These are the kind of temperatures you'd expect from water cooling. This is pretty impressive result. Right, so before I get to my key takeaways here, I did want to mention, I forgot to talk about the power supply I used, which is the Lee Edge 1300 watt 80 plus platinum power supply. And I don't think that they're making this anymore. I looked around and I didn't see that it was available any longer. I think the highest one I saw now is the Lee 1200 watt Edge. That's a 80 plus gold. So just be aware of that in case you go looking for a similar power supply. Let's talk about some of the things that I did run into while running the test that I found was kind of pertinent. So this 5090, the fans never stopped running. And the problem with it is that to control the fans on this GPU, you have to use the HP software that it came with, right, on that 45L. The fans keep spinning, right, whether it's at a low temperature or not, which isn't a big deal one way or the other. But if you do want to have a GPU like this, but not necessarily in an HP setup, then you'll have to use like a third-party fan controller of one kind or another, maybe something like the MSI Afterburner fan control or some other fan control software. The other thing you could potentially do is flash the BIOS with another BIOS from another 5090. As far as noise goes, both of these tracked at similar noise levels. They topped out at around like 52 decibels, but that was under constant heavy load. Most of the time it was averaging somewhere between 40 to 42 decibels on both sides. The 52 decibels were just spikes, right? And so I wasn't all that concerned with the noise level for that, but I did think it was pertinent for you guys to know the differences in noises, if anything. Now, the final key takeaway here is really they perform pretty similarly, not vast amounts of differences, right? And so there is no difference as far as overall performance goes, but there is a difference in temperatures. So that was really interesting that this GPU performs the same as this GPU, but 20% cooler, right? To a point where, as I said earlier, it's kind of the temperatures you'd expect when you're water cooling a GPU. And to support that, recently I came across a video from Jay's 2 Cents where he put an Asus Astral 5090 on a water block. I think it was from Bits Power. And so he did some temperature comparisons between that and the air cooling. And I don't really care about the results of the air cooling side so much as the water block that he used to cool that 5090 in comparison to the temperatures for this that is air cooled. And so what I found was that this GPU, on average, over 8 different benchmarks at top temperature, it came in at 55.7 C, whereas Jay's 2 Cents came in at about 48 C, 49 C, I think, somewhere around there. And on the VRAM side, this GPU overall over those 8 benchmarks topped out at 59.5 C on average, versus Jay's VRAM for that Astral topped out at I think it was around like 66 to 67 C or so. So fairly similar results. This cooler, whatever HP did with this cooler, they did a really good job with that. Now, all that said, I'm not a big fan of HP. If you look at my review of the 45L, there was a lot of things I didn't like about that PC, but you would have to get an HP PC to get a GPU like this, unless you buy it on a third-party marketplace like, you know, Facebook Marketplace or eBay. But I don't even know that anybody's selling these on those marketplaces. Now, as well, the other caveat is that I did not test either of these GPUs in an OC environment where I'd overclock and possibly undervolt these GPUs to see where they're both stable at the highest points and equalize that and then test them. I didn't do that. So, and I'm not sure that I'm wanting to test that, but if you guys are interested in seeing those kind of results, let me know down in the comments. And if I get enough people asking for it, then I'll certainly take a look at that to see if I can make time for that. And at the same time, if you got any other questions about the rig I used, there'll be a list of parts down in the description, or any questions about these 5090s or any other PC parts, PC hardware, what's going on in the marketplace, things like that. Feel free to ask down in the comments. I'm more than happy to talk to you guys. I do love interacting with you guys in the comment section. If you've got any requests or things that you want me to cover as far as future videos go, feel free to ask about that stuff. I'm always interested in what you guys are looking for as far as not just information, but entertainment as well, right? So in the meantime, thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next one.